Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for 1 year out, Election 2024 preview in partnership with the 92nd Street Y. I'm joined by Kevin Madden, senior partner at Penta and former senior advisor and spokesman for Senator Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, as well as Simone Sanders Townsend, host of Simone on MSNBC, and former press secretary for Senator Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign. Welcome to both of you.
Great to be with you.
Good to
Simone,
be here.
let's start with you. 1 year out, where are we? What are your concerns? It's going to be a big year. Expect the unexpected.
It is going to be a big year. You know, I worked President Biden's last presidential campaign as a senior advisor. And I have to say, coming into that election year, he was considered an underdog, if you will. You know, there were a lot of people in the race. There were thoughts that he was too old. And as you know how the story went, he bested all of the other Democrats in that Democratic primary and ended up beating Donald Trump in a general election in the middle of a pandemic. I think this is a little bit different. Coming into this election year, Joe Biden isn't, a former vice president talking about what he would do as president. He is the sitting president at a time where Americans are grappling with everything from their rights and freedoms when it comes to women's rights to make decisions about their own body to what the economic outlook is and what the prices are at the grocery store if they're trying to buy a car, new or used. And I think that those are things that are going to affect how the voters feel and what they do when it comes to the ballot box. And so those are things that the Biden campaign is going to have to look intently at, in addition to how to position themselves against what I believe will be the Republican nominee, Donald Trump.
Well, I definitely have some follow-ups on that. But Kevin, let's go to you. What do you see in your crystal ball? What's your analysis heading into the election year?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Simone said. I think the thing that I'm actually the most surprised about, and I bet you Simone is too, is just how boring the Republican primary contest has been. They're really, for all intents and purposes, there really hasn't been a lot of shakeups or big controversies or big storylines coming out of the presidential primary on the Republican side. I think the one thing that we have to be very wary of is, and Simone remembers this from her campaign as much as I remember from mine, is you really want to be in control of your message and you want to be in control of the dynamics of the race. And I think that's something that every single campaign tries to focus on. But there are a lot of events right now that are sort of out of our control, that are out of the control of the candidates that could potentially shape this race, such as whatever the Fed does over the summer on interest rates, and then also the international conflicts that I think are shaping the foreign policy, national security debate that's going to take place in 2024. The Israel-Hamas war, as well as the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. So I think those are some of the unknowns. And so, and then the thing I'd say lastly would be, no matter what happens, this is going to be a very, very, very close election. 2020 came down to about 4 different states and that were decided by about 120,000 votes. I think we're all going to be sitting on the edges of our seats on election night looking at 3 or 4 states as well.
Yeah, and Kevin, just to follow up on the point on the Republican primary, you're a veteran of primary politics on the Republican side. Can anyone catch Trump? And if so, who?
Well, I think I would answer that question differently 6 months ago, but I think to date, nobody's really put together the type of campaign or the type of strategy to really force a choice for voters inside the Republican primary to choose somebody other than Donald Trump. One of the things that seems to be driving all the campaigns is that they hope that one of the other campaigns does the dirty work, which is take on Donald Trump directly and do it in a broad and sustained way. And I think all of the sort of challengers have maybe jibbed and jabbed at Trump during the course of the primary, but nobody's really taken him on in a very sustained way so that they could force a choice between their candidacy and Donald Trump's. So I think here we are, we're 5 weeks away, and Donald Trump has a really commanding lead in all of the early contests. There doesn't seem to be the consolidation that you really need in order to get into a one-on-one race with him. So for me, I think it's hard to see anybody really convincingly changing the current trajectory of the race in a way that would have it be a nominee other than Donald Trump.
Well, Simone, you mentioned being an underdog, and Barack Obama, about a year before his reelection win, called himself the underdog, and I remember that, and he was the underdog. Ran a great campaign. You've worked on the Sanders campaign in 2016. I remember interviewing the senator, thinking, how are you going to compete with Hillary Clinton? He proved me wrong and the doubters wrong and went toe to toe with her. 2020, as you mentioned, President Biden wasn't looking so great in the early states until South Carolina happened. Do you think that the Biden campaign should really embrace the underdog role as Obama did?
I think they have to, right? I think there's a lot of focus from Democratic strategists that I speak to and people who are close with the Biden campaign. A lot of focus in attempting to shift and change the media narrative, if you will. And so a lot of focus on the data of like, hey, look, the economy is doing really well. The greatest and recovery of all in all of the world when it comes to post-pandemic, so on and so forth. Unemployment, record low unemployment overall, 3.7%. These are the numbers. But the reality of the situation for people on the ground does not necessarily reflect the numbers and the data. And, frankly, as my colleague Jen Psaki says often, data does not necessarily move people. And so I think this focus on attempting to, press the media apparatus and not talk about the polls. And if they're going to talk about the polls, what about these 8 polls where Biden is doing well? Okay. Or maybe you just say, fine. I see what the polls are saying, but just watch me. What the Biden campaign needs to focus in terms of embracing the underdog, what they need to focus on is, frankly, getting out there into communities and their organizing apparatus. You hear a lot in some of the polling about how key base voters that the Democratic Party apparatus needs to do well, from the president on down, how they're feeling, from Black voters to young voters to women voters, frankly, in places and spaces across the country. And the way to shift that feeling in their narrative is you have to communicate with them early and often, not just on television. That means in their communities. I think that Democrats should treat their base voters such as persuadable voters, just how everyone targets and tries to persuade these independents or suburban women. That's how the Biden-Harris campaign should be thinking about Black and Latino voters, especially, and young people.
But Simone, are you concerned? The numbers are not great for the president right now.
The numbers are terrible.
And I've talked to some Democrats who honestly feel they sound a little overconfident, and I agree with both of you. I think this race is a toss-up. Who knows where the presidential? We'll talk about the House and Senate as well. But what do you think about that? I mean, how does Biden get back to the numbers he had in 2020? Won narrowly. But he's got to do better with young voters and minority voters.
Look, the numbers are not good right now. I know that some of my Democratic friends want to spin it. The numbers are bad, honey. I read the polls. We report on them. NBC News has recent polling that just came out, and it does not bode well for the president. But I will say that it is still early in terms. We're talking about polling that's a year, less than 10, 11 months from a general election. Battleground state polls in December 2023 are, the former strategist in me is not relying on those to make or break a campaign. However, they are important warning signs. And I think that in my conversations that I've had with campaign officials, I asked Quentin Fulks, the deputy campaign manager, I interviewed him recently for the Biden-Harris campaign. And I said, what are you going to do about getting on the ground in communities? Because yes, you've made a record investment in African-American and Latino ad buys, but ad buys don't move voters. And Quentin Fulks, acknowledged in that conversation that they know this is going to be a close race and they need to talk to people and they're going to ramp up their ground efforts come January 2024. We will see what that looks like, but there are a lot of Democrats that say that the Biden campaign should have been on the ground by now and not waiting until January, but they have been underestimated before, and I would not be surprised if, they shock us this time, but it will be close. This idea that it's a blowout because Donald Trump is under indictment, facing 91 indictments, is 4 indictments and 91 counts, is not true. It will be close. It was close last time after all the things he had done as president. It will be close this time.
Kevin, let's talk about the indictments. Certainly doesn't seem to have hurt the former president. He's doing well in primary polls. and he didn't show up for the debates. But what about next year when we see more of Trump in court? Do you think that that's going to hurt him in a general if he were to get the nomination?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened has been that's taken a lot of people by surprise has been what I would describe as the Republican antibody response. The more that Trump found himself in legal jeopardy, or the more that he was quote unquote persecuted, that's the way his supporters would say it, the more that the Republican base voters, the most active Republican base voters, rallied to his defense. And I think it's really helped him in a primary. But what's helped him in a primary doesn't necessarily translate to helpful in a general election, when in the most important swing areas of the country, in those 7 or 8 metropolitan areas and battleground states, where the collar counties and suburban areas where independent and persuadable voters really matter, the legal issues, are potentially fatal for Trump. They make his brand and his message toxic, because what those voters want is, that's what makes them swing voters, is they're more pragmatic about partisanship. They're not necessarily hard partisans. They're more independent minded. They're more pragmatic around things like the economy and national security and foreign policy and the things that are going to shape this debate. So what they want more than anything is stability, and what they want more than anything is some level of normalcy. And so the indictments and the legal fights that play out, they could really be harmful in those six or 7 areas around the country that really are going to matter. And that's the message that, so you see Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis increasingly pressing, though they haven't done it in a sustained way, and they haven't done it in a sharp enough way to really make that case inside a Republican primary to date.
Simone, how concerned are progressives that President Biden is going to strike some type of deal on the border / immigration to keep the government open and or to pass foreign aid to Israel and Ukraine?
I think this is a concern over a segment of the progressive Democratic Party apparatus, and also members on the Hill from not just the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, but also the Congressional Black Caucus. I think folks have to remember that the reason this current debacle, this pickle, if you will, about border funding is even an issue is because the Republican-controlled House of Representatives is using border security and at the southern border, to be very specific, as a bargaining chip when it comes to funding for our allies in Israel and in Ukraine, and not to mention Taiwan. I don't know if that is going to end up boding well for House Republicans in the end, right, as it goes forward. Now, we'll note that, the president did send forward a package that asked for money for Taiwan, Israel, Ukraine, and border security. But some of the things that are being discussed are things like mandatory incarceration for asylum seekers. Some of the things that are being discussed are, and families, meaning putting families who come to the southern United States border who are fleeing famine, persecution, just some very harrowing just circumstances, who rarely want to leave home. I worked on the root causes of migration when I worked at the White House, when I worked for the vice president. And I've been down to Guatemala. I've talked to a number of these officials and the people who have, they know folks who have made this journey. So that is what we're discussing, jailing people, essentially appending the system as it sits. And I don't think Democrats have really figured out how to talk about immigration reform, what's happening at the southern border, in a way that is beneficial to them just yet. It is still very much a conversation and language that is a liability. And I think they often get caught up in these political games. And that is why you have seen such a rebuke as of late from parts of the Democratic coalition who are hearing what the White House, the Department of Homeland Security, and Democrats on the Hill are negotiating in the Senate, and they are concerned.
Kevin, what do you think about that? You used to work on Capitol Hill. Republicans, when we talk to them, they say they're not going to back down on their border asks. It's very hard to strike any type of deal on immigration, but they point to the polls saying, no, we've got the advantage here. Do you think there will be a government shutdown, or do you anticipate some type of deal?
I do believe that there will be some level of shutdown. You're right. It's near impossible to get something done on immigration right now, given the state of partisanship up on Capitol Hill, but also just given the margins. So it's just very hard to drive consensus within party leadership nowadays. It's much different than when I worked up there. We had much bigger margins, and we also had a much stronger level of control over our caucuses and conferences, both on the Republican and Democratic side, because we just had different chains of communication. I think social media has dramatically changed the incentive structure for so many of these members of Congress. They are more interested in getting the feedback loop from their conservative or liberal bases and getting support there than they are thinking about long-term goals of their caucus or their conference when it comes to legislating. So it's just very, very difficult to see. I think the politics are very troubling for the Biden White House. I think this is an issue that people believe, both Republicans, even some conservative Democrats, and many independents believe that the border issue right now, our border security issues, are a problem, and they're looking for common sense solutions. I don't think what the Republicans are proposing is really seen as extreme or outside the lines when it comes to what some legislative solutions that their problem was. There's more money, more attention, more enforcement at the border. So the politics, I think, are sort of aligning for Republicans on this, and I think that's why they're going to be dug in. They feel like they have leverage here, and the interesting thing is, to Simone's earlier point, is everything on Capitol Hill becomes a bargaining chip when you have this level of partisanship and you have these slim of margins up in both the House and the Senate.
Now, I agree with you that on the border, Republicans feel like they have the edge. But there are some Republicans, I talk about an issue that certainly unites Democrats. There are some that divide them. But impeaching the president, some Republicans have said publicly that this is not a winner. This is a political loser, including Mike Huckabee. What do you think? They've started the impeachment inquiry. It's tough to stop that when you start it, right, Kevin?
Yeah, and the other thing is, again, the incentive structure that you set up with base Republicans who feel that any sort of retreat from that would be a capitulation to the left. And they set themselves up to lose here, because I think, again, going back to the voters that are really going to make or break whether or not the Republicans or Democrats are in the majority, the independents and swing voters in the majority maker districts around the country, as well as who's going to be the next leader of the free world in the presidency. They want a level of stability and normalcy. And impeachment process, they have a very high bar when it comes to that impeachment process. And I don't think when it hasn't been met, and in this case it has yet to be met, I think the politics are sort of very perilous for those that are trying to pursue it. Now, the one thing I'd say for in their defense, or what I think is driving a lot of this, and where the White House has some problems on this, is that every step of the Hunter Biden inquiry has resulted in more embarrassing information and more embarrassing headlines on that inquiry and for the president. And so there's some peril there for the White House as well.
Simone, what's your take? Impeachment going to backfire on the GOP?
I think potentially. I mean, if you look at just the data of past impeachments, and just to set the stage right for folks, because sometimes I think because Donald Trump also faced 2 impeachments, you might have the idea that impeachment is just something Congress does. But there have only been 5 impeachments in the Congress's history, 5 impeachment inquiries that have been opened. And Joe Biden is the 5th impeachment inquiry in the history of Congress that has ever been opened. And every modern day impeachment inquiry that has been opened after some credible evidence of wrongdoing by the president at the time was found while they were president, right? So that is usually the bar. And to Kevin's point, that bar here has not been met. Impeachments usually bolster the person that is attempting to be impeached. Donald Trump saw his numbers go up when both times he faced impeachment inquiries from a Democratic House. One could argue, so same for then Bill Clinton. Nixon didn't actually get to go through an impeachment inquiry because he resigned, right? But the House at the time was ready and willing to start the process. So history would tell you that Joe Biden is going to fare well from an impeachment inquiry. But I think it's just important that if that's what conventional wisdom says, and frankly, if that's what the Biden White House actually does believe, then they have to be aggressive in fighting it. And you saw Hunter Biden this year in December stand on the steps of the Capitol in defiance of a subpoena from the House Oversight Committee. They asked him to testify in private. Hunter Biden said, "I want to testify. I will testify, but only in public." And he stood on the steps of the Capitol. And as I like to say, I think when they go low, Democrats need to go toe to toe, and that doesn't often happen. But you saw Hunter Biden going toe to toe. That was good for Hunter Biden. One could argue, was it good for the Biden White House? Probably not. But the Biden White House, I believe, if this impeachment inquiry process is in fact going to play out, then they have to be aggressive with their pushback. And frankly, Democrats have to be more aggressive. I host a show on television. I watch TV all day long. I am hard pressed to find multiple people that the Democratic Party apparatus, like the DNC or the campaign, are putting out to defend the president. Not a good place to be.
Right. No, that's that. There has been some frustration, as you mentioned, with the DNC. Simona, I want to talk about the battle for Congress. If you look at the House and Senate, obviously the White House is up for grabs, but everything's up for grabs. Senate's up for grabs. We're talking about narrow majorities in the House. In the House, you've got a number of Republicans who are defending their seats in California and New York, and that's going to be tough to defend in a presidential election year. Speaker Johnson, new Speaker Johnson, his number one goal is to not only keep his majority, but to expand it. In the Senate, the map really looks really good for Republicans. Democrats defending a slew of seats, especially in red seats. There's a decent chance that both chambers could flip the other way, where Democrats win the House and Republicans take the Senate. What's your take, Simone?
I'm weary always to make predictions such as these, but I will go ahead and make one. My prediction is that Democrats take back the House. Speaker Hakeem Jeffries makes history as the first Black speaker in the House of Representatives, and then Democrats lose the Senate. Because just the Senate, the numbers are just, it's going to take a lot for Democrats to hold the Senate. You have Joe Manchin not running for re-election. There are just the map is red and it's tough, and the issues are deep. It could be done. I don't think it will be done. But when it comes to the House, there are 18 Republicans that currently sit in districts that Joe Biden won in 2020. On top of that, given the Section 2 case of Alabama, what was it? The Allen v. Milligan case, Supreme Court case earlier this year that upheld Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in Alabama, was been used in many other states, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, in addition to Alabama, not to mention the redistricting commission happening in New York. The state Supreme Court in New York just ruled that the map that was used in 2022 now has to be redrawn, and that the new map will be used for 2024. Democrats could pick up 4 seats, maybe 5 in New York alone. An additional majority Black district seat has been created in Alabama. A similar thing is potentially going to happen in Georgia, and there's an identical case in Alabama in Louisiana. If Democrats get 5 seats, get 5 new potential seats in New York, plus 3 seats from Alabama to Louisiana to Georgia, Hakeem Jeffries is the speaker. That is not the same situation happening on the Senate side.
Kevin, it's without a doubt, Hakeem Jeffries is very involved in all these redistricting fights, especially in his home state of New York. But what's your crystal ball say a year out? I know a lot can change, but redistricting could matter because it could just come down to 2 or 3 races that we may not know the result of it. People forget that House races sometimes take weeks to decide. We may not even know the majority of the House until weeks after the election.
Yeah, I agree with everything Simone said. I mean, I think she's looking at the same numbers and trend lines that I am. I think in particular, the New York redistricting is going to figure very prominently in Democrats' calculus for how they get back the majority. And then but look, one of the things I think is important is maps and redistricting doesn't necessarily win elections. Candidates still do. So there's still a lot of time between now and then. where we can see some really some resource battles on the ground in some of these suburbs of New York and some of the suburbs of, Pennsylvania. But I do think that the advantage right now really does go to Democrats because of that. But we'll have to see. I think the one thing that's been interesting for me is now generic ballots don't win elections either, but how competitive Republicans have still remained on the generic ballot. I think that's still driving a lot of enthusiasm with folks over at the NRCC, and I think they're using it to try to raise funds in order to win many of these competitive districts around the country. The other issue, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about this a little bit more at length, is one of the things that's tough in many of these districts is the backdrop of abortion politics, which I think is continuing to sort of vex many Republicans who, for many years, had sort of had run on the default Roe v. Wade being decided law, and now, as you go state by state, and many of these state by state litigations of abortion policy are serving as a backdrop for get out the vote enthusiasm. Many these districts where you see Democrats really start to do an incredible amount of are driving energy within their base to get out the vote, talking about the stakes of the election as it relates to abortion politics.
And Kevin, on that point, of course, Donald Trump doesn't have the nomination, but there's been speculation. Lindsey Graham has hinted that maybe Trump will embrace a 15-week threshold on abortion. Trump has said that the issue is certainly helping Democrats and hurting the GOP. Do you think he's going to do something to try to, with the base can't get too upset at him, right? Because he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices that overturned it. But how do you see Republicans handling that? Because that's a big part of the reason there was no red wave. Abortion really got the vote out for Democrats.
I don't have a clear answer on that because I don't think the party has a clear answer. I don't think they have a clear answer on strategy, and they definitely don't have a clear answer on message. One thing I'd say to Donald Trump is this is where Donald Trump is often exposed as not being an ideologue. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't really care about policy. When people say, I disagree with the way Trump says X, but I like his policies, he doesn't really have a devotion to a framework of principles or policy ideals. Instead, he does what's good for Donald Trump. So one of the things to watch in the next couple of months is, does what Donald Trump does that's good for Donald Trump start to be at odds with where Republican candidates and strategies and messages are trying to be formulated in order to win back majorities? It really right now is very unclear, and the party, I think, is in a struggle with how to manage its profile on this issue in a post-Roe world.
Simone, on that issue, the midterms, well, the Republicans did win the House. There was no red wave. We've talked to some Democrats who they're upset with the White House and the DNC on messaging on the economy. They still have to talk about the economy, and they feel in 6 months we may have a soft landing, and that would help them. But some Democrats say, let's lean more into abortion. It's an election strategy that works. What do you think about that?
I don't think it's a either or. I think it's a both and. And to be very clear, for many families in America and women in this country, abortion is in fact an economic issue. The ability to be able to have the autonomy on when you have a child or not is quite important. Can you afford it, especially in a country where maternal mortality rates are just abysmal, especially if you are a woman of color, especially if you are a Black woman, in a country where, we talk a lot about social services and government assistance, right? Some of my Republicans on the Hill talk often about that. There aren't wraparound services for, single mothers in America in the way that some of our national discourse would have you believe. So I do think it is an economic issue for folks. And I think the Democrats, yes, they have to talk about the economy as well, but leave the acronyms and the Bionomics at home. Just talk about what is happening for people. Talk about the factories that have come into towns. Do what Governor Beshear of Kentucky did in his race to recapture and to keep the governor's mansion, right? Governor Beshear is a Democratic governor of Kentucky, reelected this year in a very contentious race. And he did not run away from the Biden agenda, I would argue, but he never uttered the words Bionomics, but he talked about the jobs that were being brought into the state thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure plan and what kind of jobs and what that meant for people in his state. He also very notoriously vetoed some anti-LGBTQ legislation and said he did so because of the issue of freedoms, and that he believes parents should be able to make the decisions for their children, and he believes that everyone should have the freedom. I mean, kind of turning that argument on its head. So I think you have to do both. And again, data does not necessarily move people. It may move us TV folks. It definitely could sway a print reporter at the Wall Street Journal or two, but data doesn't always move the voters.
But you think acronyms and the term Bionomics should be kind of shelved and talk more in kind of a non-Washington type of speak?
I think Bionomics was the craziest thing they could have done. I don't understand it. I mean, I wasn't alive then, but was Ronald Reagan walking around talking about Reaganomics himself, or did the other people brand it and then they bolstered it, right? You just have to tell the people what you have done and what it means for them, what is happening in their communities. That is language that folks understand. I don't think people. I've asked Democrats on my show. I said, well, what is Bionomics? Describe it. Tell me what it is. They're like, well, the definition, yes, exactly. The definition, people don't necessarily understand what Bionomics is. And so let's not force a definition on people. Just tell people what has happened.
Kevin, the Republican Party, as you know, has changed dramatically over the last 10, 20 years. And a lot of that has to do with former President Trump. Why do you think he's been so successful? And he's been counted out so many times, and yet here he is, dominating the field, the likely nominee. And where does the party go from here?
Well, it's interesting. It's a really good question. And I think if I take a step back and answer it in a very meta way, with a lot of Republicans, I think I catch a lot of people by surprise when I say that Donald Trump will have had a bigger impact on the Republican Party and its profile than Ronald Reagan ever did, because he really has reshaped the party's message, the party coalition, how it appeals to voters, and even the tactics of how candidates argue politics. So we used to be a party when it was more defined in the image of Reagan and Reagan's ideals as a party that was very focused on talking about what it was for and why, and also very optimistic about the future of America. And Donald Trump has prospered because he's really focused on what people are worried about and who's to blame for it. And that contrast right now at a time of very high partisanship has worked in his favor. I think one of the things that he's done well is the economy right now, probably in the next 10 to 20 years, will change as dramatically in the next 10 or 20 years as it did in over the last 100. And with that comes a modernization of our economy that really changes the nature of how people are employed, how they train, how they live, how they work. And Donald Trump and the people who worry about that, from everything from influx of immigration to technology, you name it, Donald Trump has really tapped into that fear that people have about that, and he's told a lot of voters that you're right to worry. And by the way, it's all of the elites in Washington that are to blame for this, and I'm here to sort of fix it. And that's tapped into a very visceral feeling of anxiety that a lot of voters have. I mean, if you think about it, like Make America Great Again, right? The idea of going back to this time where the power was in a lot of these communities around the country, where many of them feel like their economic way of life and their way of life overall is under threat. So he's really tapped into that. And I think that's what's changed the sort of coalition. If you look at a state like Ohio, that eastern corridor of Ohio, the Mahoning Valley, that used to be rock solid Democrat voters, blue collar, lunch pail, auto workers, textile workers, that were very, very dependable Democratic voters. Now, a lot of those counties have gone red, and they're voting for Donald Trump over Joe Biden as a result of that. So he's certainly shifted the politics and the coalitions of how we win and fight elections.
Mm-hmm. Simone, let's talk about third parties. Basically, 2 out of 3 people don't want to vote for President Biden or former President Trump. And now we have a lot more third parties than we usually do, certainly more well-known people. No Labels is considering throwing out a ticket out there. In any presidential cycle, it's always an uphill battle, but the numbers are troubling for both candidates. And obviously, both Biden and Trump don't want the third parties playing a spoiler, whether that's RFK Jr. or Cornel West. There's a lot of them out there. We saw of how they can make a difference. And when Joe Biden wins 3 states by 43,000 votes, I mean, that's really tight. And certainly getting 10,000 votes in a state is not that hard for some of these well-known people. RFK Jr. is actually now polling in the 20s. How do you think this is going to play out, the third party phenomenon in 2024, Simone?
So I think that there are 2 things at play here, right? One, when folks are asked in polling or focus groups, right, it's usually in polling that we see this. Do you want to see Donald Trump and Joe Biden have a rematch in 2024? They say no. And I think a lot of times people take that and say, oh, okay, those people want to vote third party. But then you ask some of those same voters in maybe a focus group, right, though, but okay, if your choice is between Joe Biden and Donald Trump or a third party, and if you ask Democrats, will they vote for Joe Biden? A number of people are still saying yes. My colleague, Kristen Welker, the moderator of Meet the Press, was in Michigan recently, did a focus group with Michigan voters, and the chyron at the bottom of the screen said reluctant Biden voters, because all of the Democrats in the room said, there were 5 Democrats in the room, 3 raised their hand, said that they would be voting. And when asked, they all said reluctantly. They literally said reluctantly Joe Biden. So I think it depends on, there's people that don't want to see a matchup, but there are a lot of Democrats that still say, yes, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. There are, though, a lot of younger voters, frankly, who are considering voting third party, or I would argue also voters, Black and Latino men, who I think Democrats should heavily just put in the independent voter camp, frankly, and really treat them as persuadables, could vote third party or just not vote at all. And that is why this third party threat is the biggest threat to Joe Biden. There's not evidence that I have seen that a third party threat, it threatens the potential Republican candidate on the ticket in Donald Trump. It disproportionately affects Joe Biden in everything. And just to drive this home for people, you must, in a general election, get 270 electoral college votes to become the president of the United States. 269 will not cut it. With the number of third-party candidates that have thrown their hats in the race and who have the money and the infrastructure, frankly, to get on the ballot in key states, if there is a real scenario here that neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden get to 270, and in that case, the House of Representatives is the House that decides who the president of the United States is. Look up the 12th Amendment, folks.
Yeah, and that very well could happen. Certainly, that's been speculated on before, especially with these tight elections. Kevin, you want to get your take on the third parties. Do they have any chance to succeed? And who do you think they would hurt more?
Well, Paul Begala taught me many years ago that third parties are like bees. They sting and then they die. And so the idea that a third party can win is sort of a fantasy that's sort of cooked up in, like, for a season 7 of House of Cards or something. And to Simone's point, this is all about electoral votes. And if you look at any state that has elected a statewide independent, the elasticity of the electorates just isn't there to ever really win. So I think the electoral votes for all the states, if you added them up, that elected statewide independents, I think it's somewhere in like the high 20s. So the idea that they're going to be able to get to 270 is just pure fantasy. I think the more likely scenario is that they take enough in key states to prevent one of the candidates from winning some really key electoral votes. So you take a state, this is basically going to come down to Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan or Pennsylvania. And if somebody is either holding their nose and not voting, or deciding that they're going to hold their nose and vote for a third party candidate, and whereas they wouldn't have voted, they would have potentially voted for either Trump or Biden, it'll keep that candidate from winning that particular state. So I just tend to think that I agree with Simone that the third party threat right now is just a bigger threat to Biden in many of these states.
Kevin, now we're getting to the fun part of state-specific stuff. And it used to be, the battlegrounds have shifted. It used to be, Florida was seen as a battleground presidential. Ohio was seen as a battleground. Times have changed. States have changed. Kevin, what states, what do you think are the 2 or 3 most important states? In a recent poll, Biden was down 10 in Michigan. He can't lose Michigan and win, can he?
He cannot. You're right. That's a key part of the calculus of their calculus right now to get to 270 or 270. And I remember, yeah, you're right. I mean, so much of this has changed. I remember when I was on the 04 campaign for the president's reelect, President George W. Bush's reelect in 04. And I remember Ohio was one of my main states, and I remember constantly being called into the campaign manager, Ken Melman's office, to report out what the latest status was on Ohio. And Ohio's trended more red. I think it's still going to be a contested state, but it's trended more red. Same thing with Florida. Colorado used to be a battleground state. It has now trended pretty strongly blue. But I think if I'm going to look at 3 states, the 3 top states I'm looking at are in this order: Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. I think the election really does come down to the suburbs of Atlanta, the suburbs of Maricopa County and the surrounding areas, and then the suburbs of Milwaukee. That's going to make or break who wins this election.
Simone, you agree with that? Would you pick another state perhaps that you're watching, or are those the 3 that you think are the ones? There aren't that many, when you think about it, a lot of blue and red states across country.
A lot of blue and red. I'm going to throw Michigan and Pennsylvania in there. If I had to do a top tier, my top tier would also be Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. And then my 1A would be Pennsylvania and Michigan. I think people should remember that the largest Arab American population, one of the largest Arab American populations in the country, is actually in Michigan. It's in Dearborn, the suburbs of Michigan. A Democrat does not win the state of Michigan in a presidential or a governor's race, frankly, and lose Dearborn. It is a key part of the suburbs of Detroit that you must win. And that is where the Israel-Hamas war and the visceral reaction, frankly, that the world and voters have had to the full brunt force that the Israeli government has inflicted upon the Gaza Strip that has affected the Palestinian people. Everybody understands you got to go get Hamas, but the effect that this has had on the Palestinian people is going to play out domestically in at least the suburbs of Michigan. And so I think that it's going to be tight, it's going to be close. And the president and the vice president, they've been doing a lot of traveling, but as I heard someone say today, it's been a lot of governing, not necessarily a lot of campaigning. And I think that they are going to definitely need to ramp up the campaigning aspect of what they are doing to make sure that they close some of these margins and come out victorious in key spaces and places across the country.
On that point, Simone, 2024 is not going to be 2020. The COVID pandemic is still, COVID is still with us, but the pandemic is over. Joe Biden is going to have to be out on the campaign trail a lot. There have been a lot of questions, concerns in polls about his age. How should Democrats handle that issue and the White House deal with the age issue? Because it's one that is obviously, as David Axelrod recently said, age only goes in one direction, and it's a problem for a lot of voters out there who are hesitant to vote for Biden at his age.
David Axelrod, such a reliable surrogate for the Biden-Harris campaign, don't you all think? Look, I think that they have to attack the age issue head on, okay? The president is old. Yes. So what else? So is, frankly, Donald Trump. So and I just think that it has to be about the choice. You heard Kevin say earlier that Republicans in the primary have not necessarily, it's no longer a choice. There's not a credible choice that people are making between Donald Trump or any of these other candidates. In the general election, there will be a choice that voters have to make between Joe Biden and, at this point, we believe it will be Donald Trump. And what is that choice? And I think the way the campaign should and needs to set it up is, sure, you can talk about me being old, or we could talk about the fact that the other guy says that on day one, he's going to be a dictator. right? You could talk about the fact that Joe Biden is old, or we can talk about the fact that thanks to, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, if you are on Medicare, insulin is capped at $35 for anyone who needs it on Medicare, right? We can talk about the fact that I'm old, or we can talk about the fact of what Donald Trump is talking about doing. Jailing his opponents, punishing the news media, jailing journalists in America. Like, this is the choice here. But that is where the campaign has to get to. And I think for a while, they kind of like shied away from and really balked at this idea talking about the president's age. I will tell you that when I worked the campaign in 2020, the age thing was something that was on the internet, right? It was in right-wing conservative media circles. A lot of this was on the internet, this idea that, Joe Biden was having his strings pulled by a puppet. He wasn't all the way there. Well, this is no longer an internet issue. You talk to just voters, people that support, Democrats who support the president. They say, oh, but I'm concerned because he's old. And so they have to remove that concern off the table and not make age a liability. And lastly, I would just say, has anybody listened to a Donald Trump rally as of late? The gentleman does not sound coherent.
Kevin, your thoughts on this? Remember, 2016 was the general election matchup with the oldest candidates, and then of course 2020 came along, and here comes 2024. I think Simone raises some very good points. I don't think the White House has dealt with the age issue very well. How should they handle it? Because there's no fountain of youth. How do you deal with it from a communication standpoint?
Yeah, she does bring up some good points. I think, like, if I'm a Biden staffer, this is the issue that worries me the most. I think there's a almost 0% chance that Joe Biden during the course of this campaign doesn't have a sort of holy smokes moment where we are sort of reinforced or reminded how old he is. And this is where it's sort of cruel advantage in the sense that, it's kind of like swimming with sharks. Donald Trump doesn't have to outswim the shark. He just has to outswim the person he's swimming with. And so he just has to be a little bit younger and look a little bit more adroit on the campaign trail than Joe Biden. And so that is where I think it's an unfair disadvantage for the Biden White House, but it's a disadvantage nonetheless. I think the way that I would try to solve this, because the thing that's really tough about campaigns is they are grueling. They are 20-hour days. Even when you're sleeping, you're not sleeping. They take a really mental and physical toll on you. And so imagine being the candidate in the middle of it. I think the way to sort of solve this is to, address it head on and try to put the president in opportunities where he's, he's doing shorter events, but a lot more events. And that he's, getting to work the rope line so that they're showing a little bit more of his retail strengths when he is in these events, rather than having big events where he's doing a lot of speaking and he's asked to do a lot more of a performance aspect. So I would try to atomize or slice up the opportunities for the president to communicate during the course of the campaign, and it's going to be an issue. I think it's the one thing that you see in both anecdotal evidence and empirical evidence that's sort of driving a lot of voter worries right now.
Kevin, and campaigns, and you mentioned it's how exhausting it is. Campaigns have to make choices, and these choices can somehow make the difference. In 2020, then President Trump really tried to shore up his base. He didn't really make a play for independence. Now, as he tells people and reminds people, he did get more votes the second time than the first time in 2016, but he didn't win independence. Joe Biden won independence, and that was the difference. Now independents are not certainly crazy about the president, very skeptical, looking around for another choice perhaps. But I know you have to do both. You have to get the base out and play for independence. Do you think that Donald Trump, who had a rough 2022, he was labeled the loser of the midterm elections for a lot of controversial things, recruiting bad candidates in the Senate, but 2023 has been a good year for Trump. Do you think he's going to make more of a play for independence, and would that be a smart move?
I think it would be a smart move, but it's really not in his nature to sort of drive on a strategy that is tactical and forward-leaning, and also sort of entrepreneurial. Like he's very much a read and react player, and he doesn't really take advice. People always say that. They're like, boy, if Trump could really just bear down and focus on policy and really be more be more focused on bringing people together, that would he would win by 5 points. And I'm like, every strategy that I hear from folks on that sense is it's all designed around the idea that Donald Trump's going to have a personality transplant. He is who he is. He's not going to change. Right. So I think the thing about this is probably the Biden team's greatest opportunity, which is how toxic the Trump brand is in the most important swing areas around the country on some of the bigger issues. And that's the way to sort of, and the thing about independents is they're the most mobile. They're the folks they may be parked in undecided right now, but they're the ones who are probably the best opportunity for you to sort of move from from a 4 on a scale of 1 to 10 to an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10 on whether or not they're going to vote for Joe Biden. So that's really the biggest opportunity. But trying to think of Trump as being more as moderating or developing a strategy or sticking to a plan, like, it's just not going to happen. It's not in his nature.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. He is who he is. Simone, is that a real opportunity then for Democrats who took advantage of that space in the middle that Trump wasn't making the play for?
Yes, I think it is. Look, I think that the Biden-Harris campaign, they have a lot of great things that they can run on. A lot of progress has been made. I mean, I feel like every week that there's some event that the president or vice president is doing, touting something new. You just heard just a couple of weeks ago about $8.2 billion invested in high-speed rail from Vegas to LA, investments going into rail in Chicago, high-speed rail on the East Coast. I would love to be able to get to New York much quicker from Washington, D.C. So there are things that have affected people's everyday lives that have happened, but again, how they're talking about them doesn't necessarily translate to that. But it is still early, ish, so they have time to get that together. I think that independent voters, they care about the economy, they care about all of these things, just like other voters too. But I think democracy is also a very it's something that can move people, and it moved folks in 2022. There are a lot of folks who were critical of President Biden right before the 2022 midterms. He went out and gave this speech about democracy in Philadelphia, and I talked to a lot of strategists that said he was missing the mark there, and he should have used it as a better opportunity to maybe drive home a little more about the economy or a little more about MAGA Republicans. But the effects of the 2022 midterms tell us that people do care about their rights, their freedoms, and that is a motivating factor for them at the polls. And I do think that is something that the president himself, the vice president, and the campaign apparatus has to lift up and also drive home in these times.
Simone, we've talked a lot of issues today, abortion, economy. What's a sleeper issue that you see out there that you think maybe could make a difference? And we're talking about differences again. We're talking about tens of thousands of votes. Some issue that maybe doesn't attract the headlines, but is one that's very important for the candidates to talk about.
Well, I'll say this. I think that because I think it's something like guns, frankly, right, or police brutality. Those are things that do attract headlines when they happen. But when it is not, when a mass shooting is not front and center right in front of us, it is not necessarily the topic of conversation, even though guns are the number one killers of our children right now. You have to remember in the summer, in the lead up to the 2020 presidential election, it was a summer of protests because of I feel like the country was at a boiling point, and it tipped over with the death of George Floyd. There's a long time between now and November 2024. Who knows what else could happen that could galvanize an electorate or tip the scales in some way? We just saw Kate Cox in Texas, right? A woman whose doctor told her she needed an abortion because her pregnancy was no longer viable, and the state told her she could not get one. She sued. A lower court said yes. The state Supreme Court said actually no. Brittany Watts in Ohio, a young Black woman who had a miscarriage and who flushed the toilet and is now being charged with a felony. These are things that just recently happened. Who knows what could happen between now and November that could also be something that, again, pushes an electorate to just really make a drastic change.
Kevin, same question to you. What kind of below the radar issue do you see maybe could play a big role in 2024?
Affordable housing. I think just the pressure that many people are feeling, those that own a home are feeling pressure, I think, on it being like their main investment. And then in many communities, people who are seeing rising rents and then being pushed out of those communities because there's a lack of affordable housing. I think it's a huge concern for many big companies and many big employers around the country where they're trying to find affordable housing for their workers. So it becomes one where really does drive people's view on whether or not the economy in their local community or their local region is healthy or not. So I think it's one where a lot of if candidates seize the right opportunity to sort of message on that, I think it can really align them with a lot of voter sentiment.
Simone, do you think there's going to be any general election debates between the two? Well, maybe among, if we have more than two people who qualify, but do you think there will be general election debates? Obviously, that was a controversy the last time around, and Trump is not debating his Republican rivals. So what do you see there? Do you think it'd be wise for Biden to debate Trump or no?
I think there will be general election debates because Donald Trump will need to debate in the general election. Donald Trump did not debate in the primary because he didn't need to stand next to people that were not polling anywhere near where he was. If I was advising the Trump campaign, which I never would have done in ever my little short life, I would not have advised my candidate in Donald Trump's position to stand on a Republican primary debate stage either.
Kevin, what do you think?
I hope not. Does anybody remember the last one? It was so bad. I think I hope not, but I think there will be one, and maybe just one, so that way we all don't have to agonize on whether or not there's going to be two or three of them. But it's unfortunate, but they've become totally about performance rather than really the substance that we need on the big debate, on the big issues.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that had Trump been a lot more calm in that first debate, maybe he'd still be president. I'm sure there are a lot of campaign people who are watching this, and you both have a lot of experience on campaigns. So I want to end, Simone, we'll start with you. What were your takeaways from working on campaigns? What advice would you have to others who are working on presidential campaigns?
I think my biggest piece of advice that definitely helped me when I was on presidential campaigns is to talk to real people, not just the folks that sit near you in the office or your friends in Washington, D.C. And I think it's really important to listen to what actual real people, not the polls, but people are saying on the ground in key spaces and places. So get out there, get on the ground, hear what they are saying, and then apply it, because that can make the difference between Joe Biden winning Arizona or Georgia or Donald Trump being victorious.
Kevin, what
Look,
do
I
you
think
like?
I think that's great advice. I would agree with it. I think the worst place to really see a campaign is from the bus and the plane, and also these events that are sort of prefabbed all the way around the country. The more that you can get off the bus and go and talk to the folks go talk to the people who are doing volunteer calls, find out what they're hearing as far as good and bad. Use it to calculate it back into a better strategy for the campaign. Same thing for reporters. I think reporters are not going to really get the story about what's driving voter sentiment by just covering events. If they get a chance to go out to the local VFW, they get this chance to go out and talk to any congregation of voters around the country and really ask them the questions, not about horse races, forget about the polls, forget about the ads, but really say, like, what are you hoping to hear from a candidate? What would address the concerns of someone like you? You learn a lot more about what's really going to shape the debate. You become there are fewer surprises when you go out and you really go out and try to find the heartbeat of the electorate and really talk to voters.
Kevin and Simone, two of the smartest people in politics. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
And thank you for watching. 1 year out, 2024. It's going to be a great year. Then the Hill and the 92nd Street Y. Very excited about this new initiative. Have a great holiday season.